American Health Organization, and we will respond promptly to any request for materials, supplies, technical assistance, or strategic guidance regarding the nature of mass gatherings or any other control measure that Brazil wishes us to do so.
Question for a journalist, that would be really good. The next question is coming from Greece. That's Kostas from ERT Television. Kostas, please unmute yourself and we will be able to hear you.
Hello to everybody. Thanks for taking my question. Since the beginning of the pandemic, states have been called upon to identify cases and test citizens. PCR and antibody tests are already in use. Lately, we have been observing groups of researchers analyzing city wastewaters to determine the degree of contamination of areas by coronavirus. Can this innovative tool give us a faster and more realistic picture of the pandemic versus the usual test? Thank you.
Tests, antibody tests, or?
No. It's a question about analyzing cities' wastewaters to determine the degree of contamination of areas. Can this give a faster and more realistic picture of the pandemic?
Thank you very much for that.
So I can start, but maybe Mike will want to add. So yes, sorry, I didn't hear the question before. So there's a number of ways in which we are looking to evaluate how the virus is circulating globally. You mentioned two of those, the use of molecular tests or PCR tests, which are measuring active infection in people. There's the use of the antibody tests, which are also testing people, but that's testing past infection. We have a unit here that's looking at wastewater, that is looking at if the virus, live virus, or fragments of the virus are found in wastewater. We do understand that there are fragments of virus, not live virus or infectious virus, that can be found in wastewater. So it's possible that that might be something that could be used to look at where the virus may be, but it's important that we focus our attention on looking for the virus in people. Countries have demonstrated the ability to, if you aggressively look for cases, human cases, and find those individuals, isolate those individuals, care for them depending on the severity of their illness in a healthcare facility or at home if that can't be done, and identify all of their contacts and quarantine those contacts. We know that that works and that can stop transmission.
Point. I think we've said this a couple of times. I mean, science and discovery is very important, and looking for the virus in different samples have been able to find different ways to monitor the presence of the virus, be it in environmental samples, very important, in antibody tests in recovered patients, very important. They all have an importance, and they're all very important for understanding the long-term trajectory of the pandemic. But we seem also to be avoiding the uncomfortable reality that we need to get back to public health surveillance. We need to go back where we should have been months ago, finding cases, tracking cases, testing cases, isolating people who are tested positive, doing quarantine for contacts. We have seen time and time again in countries that have contained this virus and brought it under control without the need for massive lockdowns, have done it through the application of principled, human rights driven, but sometimes quite aggressive public health surveillance. And I think we sometimes, and I think this is something we do in society, we sometimes look for the answers where they're not. We need to go back to the basic principles of how we control this disease. A comprehensive strategy that matches basic public health surveillance, community, education, knowledge and empowerment, with the strengthened healthcare capacity to treat cases, and we are able to pull those three things together and develop a vaccine in the medium to long term. That's the core. There's a lot of other information and science that needs to be discovered around that, but we need to stick to the core strategy, or else we really will risk looking for answers where the answers are not, or the answers to the questions we're asking are not going to solve the problem we have. We know the problem we have.
Now we will go to Laurent Sierra from Swiss News. Laurent, can you Can you please unmute yourself? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for having my question. Since you raised the question of the zero test last time, the Swiss pharmaceutical group Roche got the approval from FDA, and they pretend to have a product which is trustful and 99% and more efficient. And at the same time, there was a study by the University of Zurich published in the Lancet that tend to show that COVID-19 is not only a pneumonia, but also systemic vascular inflammation. So what does these two components tell us, and what might that change in terms of response? Thank you.
So there are hundreds of tests that are available. A number of them are serologic tests, which are measuring the amount of antibodies in an individual. And some of these are undergoing different forms of validation, which is very important. This means that each of the tests that are developed are assessed and evaluated for how well they work. And there you use a known quantity of sera, of biological material, to look and see how well the tests perform. Do they actually measure what they're supposed to measure? And that's important. We are working with a number of labs and also FIND to help do validation of molecular tests as well as serologic tests. And as those validation results become available, then we will have more and more confidence in each of these tests that are out there. There are more than 90 countries that are currently conducting seroepidemiologic studies. We've mentioned that previously. And this is an important part of understanding the extent of infection in a population, in a country, and across the world.
Clinical syndromes associated with COVID-19. I think this is an important issue, because I think we've very often seen with new emerging diseases that they don't always have just one target organ. They tend to cause a much more disseminated disease. They may affect multiple organs. And it is sometimes only over time, many generations of transmission, sometimes decades, sometimes hundreds of years, where some diseases establish what looks like a preferred organ, or it becomes an endemic disease with one organ that's affected more than any other organ in the body. And we tend to often call those diseases after the organ they affect. We often call the hepatitis viruses because they cause hepatitis, inflammation of the liver. But there are many different types of virus that cause that same problem. But however, there are diseases like measles, and we often think of measles as a disease, a fever with a rash, a mild self-limiting illness in children. I can tell you that measles in an unvaccinated child who's undernourished and living in a refugee camp is a serious disease that can affect their lungs, their eyes, their brain. It can cause so many different organs to fail. It's quite frightening. So I think when we look at COVID-19, we need to see that as a disease that obviously is a respiratory disease. It's spread by a respiratory route. It causes a respiratory syndrome. It is clear that in a proportion of patients, it is causing a broader inflammatory response, either within the vascular, or that's the blood carrying system, or in other parts of the body. We've also seen reports of encephalitis, or swelling or inflammation of the brain. We've seen other reports of other effects of the disease. And that's why it's so important, as Maria said previously, that we continue to collect clinical data from across the world on all of these different impacts of the virus. But it's still primarily causing a respiratory syndrome, and you see that, unfortunately and tragically, repeated day after day in intensive care units around the world, patients struggling to breathe, with their oxygen levels falling, and having demonstrable damage by CAT scan and X-ray to their lung tissue. That is a major part of the syndrome. But clearly, the vascular effects, or the effects on the blood-carrying system or the cardiovascular system, are there, they're real, and they need to be studied further.
And David, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Can you suggest why Russia's infection rate has been rising so dramatically, and whether the WHO figures really reflect the totality of Russia rather than largely Moscow, and whether Russia is following WHO guidelines for containment, as Dr. Tedros has just outlined?
Is probably experiencing a delayed epidemic, and we've seen this in many contexts. We've seen how Italy, was one of the first countries in Europe to experience a large-scale epidemic, and it was followed by Spain, followed by the UK and others. And we believe that in that sense, Russia has experienced a delayed beginning to the epidemic and is now seeing that increase in cases. Russia has also increased its testing both in the urban areas and outside them, and the increased numbers may reflect partly that, but there's also